Hi, I'm Simon and welcome to the fourth episode of Gamer's Living Room. Now for this episode I'm going to be showing you the next machine I owned and a favourite title from it. And this is a machine that I had been reading all the hype about for 2 years before it finally became available here in the UK. So let's take a look. Well, this games console was something that I'd wanted for years. I'd been reading about it in the magazines like CMVG and Ace magazine for probably about 2 years. It was released in 1988, October 1988 in Japan, and then later in August of '89 in North America, and it didn't reach British shores until November the 30th, 1990. And that's when I got it. You've probably already guessed it. Yes, it's this. The Sega Mega Drive. Yes, this fantastic system is Sega's follow-up to the Mark III and Master System. Technically superior in every way, this machine brought Sega's home systems into the 16-bit era. Moving from the Z80, the Zilog Z80 processor, Sega built their new system around the ubiquitous Motorola 68000. It still contained a Z80, but it was only as a sound controller. And it also now contained a more advanced version of the graphical processor that the Master System and Mark III had. This all provided the new machine with enhanced graphical capabilities, taking the on-screen colours up to 64 from the previous 32, and from a palette of 512. But more impressively, it was able to handle larger and more numerous sprites than its predecessor, and without the dreaded flicker that plagued it. All three Model 1 versions of this console varied slightly in their design, but I feel that the European version is slightly more tasteful, but I prefer the Japanese version. This is also true for the styling of the box and the art of the Japanese version. Now, although I thought the US and the UK box was very cool, it's kind of a negative of the previous system. The Master System had a white box, and these ones have got black. Very cool, but I preferred the Japanese edition. And it's actually the logo and the typeface that was used that I really like about the Japanese edition. I think there's probably something about the button and maybe some of the writing that's on it. It's not as colour coordinated as this edition, but I prefer it, and I wish I had one. But I don't. I've got a PAL version, and I love it still, as you'll know if you saw the Sega Master System review. Now, the North American version even got a different name thanks to a dispute in that region that prevented Sega from using the Mega Drive name. Although I don't like the name Genesis as much as Mega Drive, it's still pretty good and suggests the birth of a new world of gaming. Although I'm sure the name was much more popular in the US than it would ever have been over here. I mean, we don't have quite as high a proportion of followers of the Lord's favourite book as they do on that side of the pond. Although saying that, I think that some Christians probably found it offensive or blasphemous that they would use such a religious reference for what is only a games console. But I don't think it hurt sales too much in North America though, as the Genesis was massively popular over there. It beat NEC's offering pretty much right out of the market and managed to keep Nintendo squarely in second place for a long time. Now, the Sega machines in all three regions went through another redesign in 1993, picking up the number 2 at the end of their name, much like with the Master System before it. And like the second incarnation of that machine, they cut down the specs, removed a couple of bits to make it cheaper for gamers of the time. However, I don't think the Model 2 is going to be as attractive for the retro enthusiast today, as you can't do quite as much with it. Saying that though, it was a much better attempt at a restyling than the Master System was. After all, they didn't cut back on any of the compatibility with games, and, well, let's be fair, it was aesthetically pleasing, which was more than can be said for the Master System too. Now again, I think the Japanese version is the best of the bunch. Actually, I think this time it's the best looking of the bunch, and I feel that the European version is the worst, at least in my eyes anyway. This beautiful machine was one I was so desperate to get that I sold my current Sega console and all of its games collection and saved up money from my birthday just so I could go down to Toys R Us on the release day and get this machine. My family were between houses at that time, and we were staying with my grandmother for a few months. I remember coming home from the toy shop, setting up the machine and plugging in the copy of Altered Beast that came bundled with it. I'd had some experience of Altered Beast in the arcades, so I was quite familiar with the graphics, sound effects, music and how the game played. Now, I'd been led to believe from the reviews in the magazines that the Mega Drive version was close to arcade perfect. I fired her up and settled down for my first game. The graphics of the arcade were instantly recognisable, but the colours didn't look as vibrant. Some of the frames of animation were missing. The screens didn't contain the same number of enemies. The sound effects were weaker, and the cool transformation sequences were chopped down to just a couple of frames. I played a few credits, but in the end was just left feeling totally underwhelmed, despite the fact that I told my mother and my nan that I thought it was fantastic. Was this really the machine I'd been waiting for all these years? Something that was seemingly, technically, no better than the Amiga. In fact, to be honest, at that point in time, I felt that the Amiga was a much better machine. Sure, it had the Sega logo that I'd come to love and respect since my first encounters with Space Harrier more than 4 years earlier. And the design of the body was almost enough to make me want this machine on that alone. And what's more, I was totally blown away by how cool the controller was. But all this aside, I was still disappointed. None of my friends had the machine, so I couldn't swap any games with anyone. I'd spent all of my money, so getting one of the release titles was out of the question. I couldn't even use the Master System games because, well, firstly, I'd sold them, and secondly, even if I hadn't, the machine as it isn't backwards compatible. At this point, I'd had the Amiga for a year and was really happy with it and the great games I'd been playing on it over the last 12 months. However, I was looking to the Mega Drive to give me an experience that the Amiga couldn't produce. I was looking for something that would take me closer to the experiences I'd had in the arcade. Those early days with the Mega Drive just weren't providing those experiences. But they did come eventually. They came Christmas 1990. When I got this. Well, no, not actually this. Not this compilation. More specifically, I got this. The Revenge of Shinobi. I'd been a fan of Shinobi, first on the Master System, and then of the arcade version when I stumbled across a place that actually had a copy of it. And now here was an updated version that was an exclusive Mega Drive title and seemingly even better than the arcade version of the original. Known as the Super Shinobi when it was released in Japan in 1989, it was a critical and commercial success. The name was changed to the more meaningful The Revenge of Shinobi when it was released in North America simultaneously with that one in Japan. It was actually a launch title over here in the UK, and thankfully they kept the American name. But unfortunately, we had to wait a year until it was released over here, obviously, because we had to wait for the system to be released. Well, let's get the Mega Drive set up, and I can tell you why this game proved to me that the £150 I'd spent on it, and the fact that I'd sold my Master System and its entire collection, wasn't a complete waste of time. Well, here we are, all set up and ready to have a blast with the Revenge of Shinobi.